In the summer of 1950, thunder echoed across the Korean Peninsula. North Korean tanks crossed the 38th parallel, igniting a brutal 3-year war that would claim millions of lives. And yet, decades later, most Americans can barely recall why it happened. They call it the Forgotten War. But why was it forgotten? How could a war that shaped the Cold War, drew in the world's superpowers, and changed Asia forever, vanish from public consciousness? Today, we uncover why the Korean War, one of the most significant conflicts of the 20th century, became history's most overlooked tragedy. 1. The war nobody declared, June 25, 1950. Before dawn, North Korean forces, armed and trained by the Soviet Union, poured into South Korea. Within days, Seoul fell. The world was caught off guard. The United States, under President Harry Truman, acted swiftly, but not with the thunder of a declaration of war. Instead, he called it a police action under the authority of the United Nations. That phrase, police action, would become one of history's most fateful acts of branding. It stripped the war of its emotional weight. It told Americans this wasn't World War II, or even Vietnam. It was an operation, temporary, limited, bureaucratic. But there was nothing small about it. By the end, 36,000 American soldiers were dead, 100,000 wounded, and millions of Koreans left homeless or dead. Yet, because it wasn't a war on paper, it was destined to fade from the headlines before the first shots were even fired. 2. The shadow of two giants. Every war lives in the shadow of another. When the Korean War began, World War II was barely over. American soldiers had just come home. Families were rebuilding. The world had labeled itself post-war. The public didn't want another fight. They wanted peace, prosperity, suburbia, not another sacrifice. Then, barely 15 years later, Vietnam erupted, and this time the war consumed America's attention. It was televised, protested, dissected. The trauma of Vietnam would burn itself into American memory, and in the process, bury Korea deeper into forgetfulness. Korea became the war between the wars, sandwiched between glory and controversy, leaving no emotional space to be remembered. 3. The Cold War's first battleground. To understand Korea, you must understand the Cold War. World War II ended with the world divided into two camps, the United States and the Soviet Union. Their rivalry wasn't just political, it was ideological, spiritual, existential. The Korean Peninsula, once unified for centuries, was split in half at the 38th parallel, Soviet-backed north and American-backed south. It was never meant to be permanent, but both sides fortified their half with soldiers, propaganda, and fear. When war broke out, the United States saw it as a test. If America didn't defend South Korea, would communism spread from Korea to Japan to the Pacific and beyond? And so, the first proxy war of the Cold War began. But this was not the kind of war Americans understood. There was no declaration of freedom, no crusade against tyranny, only an abstract idea, containment. Stopping communism, not destroying it. Managing war, not winning it. It was a moral fog, and Americans couldn't see the purpose through the smoke. 4. The War of Ice and Fire. For the soldiers, the war was anything but abstract. It was frozen mountains, muddy rice fields, bayonet charges, and bitter winters where temperatures fell below 30 degrees. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir in 1950 became a legend of endurance, where surrounded U.S. Marines fought their way out of Chinese encirclement, dragging their wounded through snow and ice. The war swung back and forth like a pendulum. Seoul captured, lost, recaptured again. Each side gained ground, then lost it. By 1951, both armies were fighting not for victory, but for position. The front line hardened around the same 38th parallel it began with. Soldiers died for hills that would be abandoned days later. It was a war of stalemates, where progress was measured not in miles, but in bodies. 5. The war the cameras forgot. Unlike Vietnam, the Korean War was fought before the television age. Footage existed, but it was black and white, grainy, often censored. Few American families had TVs in 1950, and newspapers reduced the war to small columns between ads for cars and washing machines. There were no nightly news reports showing the human cost, no iconic images like the flag raising at Iwo Jima. And with Truman's decision to avoid calling it a war, the press treated it like an operation abroad, not a national emergency. So while soldiers bled in the mountains of Korea, Americans at home tuned out, not out of cruelty, but out of distance. For many, Korea was invisible, and what people can't see, they soon forget. 6. The hero without glory. Every war has its heroes and its scapegoats. In Korea, one man embodied both, General Douglas MacArthur. At first, he was hailed as a savior. His brilliant Incheon landing turned the tide, recapturing Seoul and pushing the North Koreans back. But success bred ambition. MacArthur wanted to march north, unify Korea, and even invade China. President Truman refused, fearing World War III. When MacArthur defied orders, Truman fired him. It was a constitutional crisis that split the nation, but one that reinforced how divided America's understanding of this war truly was. Was it a fight for freedom, or a limited police action? Was victory the goal, or simply balance? Even the generals didn't know, and without a clear mission, no one knew what winning meant. 7. The war that froze in time. On July 27, 1953, the guns fell silent. An armistice was signed at Panmunjom, not a peace treaty. The two Koreas remained divided, separated by a demilitarized zone that still exists today. The war never truly ended. It just paused. For the soldiers who came home, there were no parades, no medals broadcast on television, no collective celebration. America moved on, quietly. Factories reopened, suburbs grew, children were born. The war slipped into silence, remembered only in personal scars and fading photographs. Veterans would later call it the war that never ended and never mattered. It was, perhaps, the most unjust silence in American history. 8. The forgotten veterans. It took decades for America to say thank you. The Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. wasn't built until 1995, more than 40 years later. Its haunting statues, 19 steel soldiers walking through ghostly brush, finally gave a face to those who were once faceless. For many veterans, it was too late. They had grown old, carrying the memories of a war no one asked them about. They had fought bravely, but history had written over their story with the ink of bigger wars. World War II was the good war. Vietnam was the controversial war. And Korea? Korea was the forgotten one. 9. The legacy we overlook. And yet, to forget Korea is to forget the world it made. The war cemented the U.S. policy of containment, setting the stage for every Cold War conflict that followed. It created one of America's most crucial alliances, with South Korea, now a global economic power. It also forged the blueprint for limited war, use of UN coalitions, controlled escalation, and public skepticism toward intervention. It was a turning point, not in victory, but in mindset. It taught the United States that wars could be fought without ever being won, and that some battles, especially those fought for balance, not conquest, fade quietly from collective memory. 10. Remembering the forgotten. History remembers the loud, but sometimes it's the quiet wars that shape the future. The Korean War was one such war, cold, brutal, unresolved, but essential. It preserved a democracy, restrained a superpower, and birthed an uneasy peace that still defines the 21st century. When we call it forgotten, we reveal more about ourselves than about history. Maybe what's forgotten isn't the war, but our attention. Maybe remembering Korea means remembering the cost of peace itself. The forgotten war may have faded from the headlines, but its echoes still divide a peninsula and remind us that silence is also a kind of memory. Subscribe to Timeless Questions channel to receive more thought-provoking content about philosophy, human nature, and the mysteries of existence.